Hello, ladies and gentlemen. If you could all please take your seats. The next session is starting and we're a little bit late. So let me just explain what's happening with this session and the one afterwards. Obviously, we're going to have the humanitarian session, and then afterwards, we have the 2-hour lunch break, in which there are various other activities going on, talks, walks, music, and whatnot. But actually, after this session, you have the opportunity to find out a little bit about what Scotland is doing in relation to humanitarian development aid. And so we have a session here in which I'm going to be handing over to Francis Guy, the Chief Executive of Scotland's International Development Alliance and the chair of the expert panel of the Scottish Government's Humanitarian Emergency Fund. And as I understand it, they've just launched their most recent report as to what Scotland is doing as a global citizen around the world. I will leave it to Francis to introduce the various speakers, but we're obviously going to be looking at the humanitarian situation, the aid situation globally and around the world. But if you're really interested in what Scotland's doing and has to say on these issues, then please stay in the tent. We'll probably pause for about 3 or 4 minutes so that everyone who wants to go somewhere else and attend other sessions will leave, and then we'll get going with Francis's session. So that just leaves me to introduce this session. I mean, yesterday we heard obviously some extraordinary tales from both Blinny, but also Martin Griffiths, including about those people who are doing their utmost to try and help people around the world suffering from conflict, but also from development issues, famine and whatnot. And it gives me great pleasure today to introduce 2 people who are doing precisely that, doing as much as they possibly can to help our conflicted world. Of course, Chris Lockyear from Médecins Sans Frontières, but also Sigrid Van Aken. And Sigrid Van Aken is the head of the Postcode Lotteries. And I think it's probably the best kept secret that the Postcode Lotteries, in terms of the amount of money it gives across the world to all sorts of organizations, from human rights organizations to those involved in humanitarian development and relief, is now the top third biggest donors in the world. And I want to be able also to take this opportunity to thank Sigrid for her support of our little festival and helping us to be able to convene these types of gatherings so that we can talk about some of the most pressing issues around the world. So Sigrid, I just want to thank you for the Postcode Lottery support of Beyond Borders and everything else that you do around the world. I'm going to leave it to Nicola to take it forward.
Good afternoon, everyone. What a pleasure to be here to convene what I am absolutely certain will be a really interesting and illuminating discussion. As Mark has just said, we're joined by 2 guests whose work, I think it's fair to say, represents something of a bright light in a world that seems pretty dark at the moment. And we're going to be chatting about the work that the Postcode Lottery, and Sigrid Van Aken will talk about the Postcode Lottery's work. And Chris Lockyear from Médecins Sans Frontières will talk about the work that his organisation is doing. And I think this opportunity is also one that will allow us to reflect on what all of us can be doing to try to make a difference in a world where that can seem difficult and where there is a tendency sometimes to feel a bit powerless in the face of big global developments and events. So I'm really here just to steer the discussion. We'll have a chat for about 35 minutes and then we'll open up to questions from all of you. So please feel free to ask questions to Sigrid and to Chris when we get to that point. Sigrid, I thought I'd come to you first because, as Mark has just said, you, the Postcode Lottery, is now the third biggest philanthropic organisation in the world. I think behind only the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust. You're also, and I think this is a really important point, you are a social enterprise and not-for-profit organisation, so you're all about raising money to direct to civil society organisations with a huge diversity of organisations that you support, from the truly local organisations in my own constituency to the very global. So do you want to tell us just a bit more about what you do, how you do it, and what your objectives are?
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. And it's an honor to be here on this stage after a wonderful day yesterday already. I've been so inspired, learned so much from everybody on stage here. So yes, let me share with you where this started. It was 35 years ago when our founders used to work for Oxfam, and they realized day in, day out the importance of funding, of course, for the work of Oxfam at the time. And then, because of that realization that you need this long-term financial backing when you want to change the world or make this a better place, they started in the Netherlands the Postcode Lottery. Lotteries, of course, exist for centuries. It has been an instrument for fundraising for a long, long time, and well, you will know many initiatives who use this instrument. But at the time, so this was in 1989, they were really innovative entrepreneurs, and they set up this concept completely new and disruptive in every sense. So for instance, they started by selling lottery tickets only based on a subscription, and that's how we're doing it still until today. So we have really a player base, a group of players that we know that we can reach with our stories and communicate with them. And also we only have a virtual product, so you cannot go in a shop and buy us. There's nothing against that, but I just want to show you that they really set up a new innovative format. And the key thing that they invented was not just the name, the Postcode Lottery, but the idea that you play together with your neighbors. So you have an opportunity to win with your neighbors with the same postcode, you share the big prizes, and at the same time together you're strengthening communities, not only your own community, but also communities all over the world. So this concept started in the Netherlands, and of course no one expected this to become such a success. It's always good to realize when you look back. There were even charities at the time in the Dutch context who refused to partner with the Postcode Lottery because you never knew what would come out of this new lottery at the time. So that's where it started, and here we are in 2025. We are active in 5 European countries. We started here in Great Britain 20 years ago. We are active in Sweden, in Norway, and in Germany, hopefully soon in Ontario and Canada, and well, wherever there's a civil society that wants to have a charity lottery, we are very active in promoting that model of fundraising by our organization or by others, of course. So this is what we are all about, just raising funds for charities, the more the better. And this year we hope to reach our new milestone of raising 1 billion only in this year, 2025, for about 500 charity partners all over the world, and of course grassroots organizations in local communities where we are active. So I'm quite sure there will be players of the People's Postcode Lottery in the audience here today. And I just want to thank you on behalf also of the charities receiving your money. And I hope you feel that you're contributing to something that matters.
How many players do you have in the UK?
In the UK currently we passed the milestone of 5 million playing every month.
Wow.
And that's growing because in the Dutch context there's a larger part. We exist longer, of course, there. So there's still growth potential, we believe. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I've got my own reason to be grateful to the Postcode Lottery. When I was First Minister, they asked me to present a cheque to George Clooney, which I thought was a tough job, but somebody had to do it, and I was happy to step up and make that sacrifice.
Yeah.
Chris, obviously many people here, many people across the world will be familiar in general terms, I think, with the work of Médecins Sans Frontières and the fantastic and very challenging work that you do, but can you maybe share in a bit more detail what your organisation does?
Yeah, no, sure. And hello, everybody. Also a great pleasure to be here. We're a medical humanitarian organisation. We're a private organisation. We were founded just over 50 years ago now. And one of the key things in terms of our foundation is that we were founded by doctors, yes, but also journalists. And that has been, and that sort of signifies the two pillars of how we operate, and what at that time particularly made us different from other humanitarian organizations. We were, if you like, a bit of a spin-off from the Red Cross, because we wanted to ensure that we were talking about what we were seeing and making sure that we were giving a voice to the people and helping people in various predominantly conflict areas to be able to be seen, to be able to talk and advocate for their situation. So that was over 50 years ago. We're now an organization, we are around 70,000 people. We're operating in 70 countries around the world. We really try and stick fast to the humanitarian principles of independence, impartiality and neutrality, which is something that is tested in the current global climate in a variety of contexts. And we're in a very fortunate situation to be able to do that because we are 98% privately funded. That's a very fortunate situation to be in. It's a situation of a great responsibility, but it does mean that we can make decisions independent of government influence, of militarized influence, and make decisions based on health needs and the needs of people. And that's thanks to currently 7.3 million donors around the world, which we're really trying to, the point has come up, what can we do? And this is not a fundraising pitch, but the way we like to see those 7.3 million people is people who are participating in what we're doing. It's a partnership, there's a responsibility towards that money, and that's an expression of solidarity with people around the world. So it's a social action as much as it is a financial action, and it's about acting in community. Our aim is to work essentially where it's hardest to go. There are limits to that. We need to be responsible in terms of the safety and security of our people, but we try and go to the areas where there is least healthcare, where people are most affected primarily by conflict, but also epidemics and natural disasters, to try and give people and populations basic life-saving healthcare where none exists. I mean, that's the nutshell, glossy version, if you like. Obviously, the world is a lot more complicated than that.
Which we'll probably come on to. But you've got a long-standing partnership with the Postcode Lottery. So I guess what we've got here is an example in action of the way in which the Postcode Lottery can be a force for good and supporting some valuable work.
Yeah, and it goes a little bit back to the independence point, because so the vast majority of our funding is through individuals. There's very few organizations or institutions where we partner, and we've also discussed over the last couple of days a little bit in terms of funding crisis, financial crisis around the world. But what we have here is an example of a real positive example whereby we have an ongoing sustained partnership for clear objectives. I would say that from my perspective, there's probably three areas which sort of define a good donor relationship. One of those is consistency, so predictability in terms of your funding, and we've had many years of partnership in that sense. The other is the degree to which the money is restricted or unrestricted, as in to what extent are we told where to operate, and I think roughly speaking about 90-95% of the funding that we get from the Postcode Lottery is unrestricted. And so that then leads us on to the third point, which is a notion of trust and acceptance of risk, because what we do is complicated. Things do go wrong. We make mistakes. Sometimes we try things and fail. And to be able to have that relationship and that understanding of we're not perfect, we're operating in a complicated world, but to have those 3 points of partnership, I think what really defines a positive collaboration.
Yeah, and I know, Sigrid, that's something that you are very strong on, this sense of trust-based philanthropy. And one of the things I wanted to come on and explore with both of you is how, you're both organisations that have been in existence for decades. but the world is changing and has changed very dramatically just in a short space of time. How is that changing how you operate? What challenges is that posing? How are you adapting? But is that, things do go wrong, but we live in an era where, scandals get blown up, where some governments around the world are engaged in, I guess, offering a more hostile environment to some NGOs that and the kind of work that they do. Is that one of the ways in which you're finding the work you do more challenging? Are you having to adapt in any way?
Yes, I think this is spot on. Let me first start maybe a little bit more on this trust-based philanthropy concept, because unfortunately that is very rare that donors give unrestricted funding. And that's, one of the things that also our founders at the start, already 35 years, we started with this funding philosophy that we want to have long-term partnerships with unearmarked money. Because of this realization, these initiatives, whether big or small, local or international, need the long-term financial backing to achieve any results. And in a way, it's like a business. If you start a business, you have to take risk, you have to fail, start again, and then everybody understands that this is the way you achieve success. It's the exact same thing for NGOs, charities, or civil society initiatives. You should have the room to do experiments, to try new things. How can you ever otherwise stay relevant or have an impact? So we want to provide this constant stream of funding, and so we have done so since the start. What we see, as you said, is governments on certain topics, of course, specific topics, getting pressure from NGOs, maybe more than before in some areas, and of course then very easily people start looking at who's financing these initiatives. So yes, we do experience more and more pressure in that sense, which is in our case also sensitive, because of course we need a charity lottery license from local governments in Europe to operate what we do, to do the fundraising that we do. This has nothing to do with gambling, but at the same time, it is a subscription for a lottery, so you need to have this license. So it's a balancing act, and at the same time, we like to point out that we support the civil society from culture to human rights to education, women and girls' rights, so health, any initiative in society. And we ourselves communicate explicitly most about the topics that are not controversial, that are not, part of sensitive debates, to avoid, of course, to end up in the wrong conversation. But we are proud to support all these organizations, and when there's criticism or things go wrong, our approach is that we say we support these organizations because they have support in society. They have donors, private donors, they have other partners, they might have also subsidies from governments, although there are a lot of budget cuts, of course. So there are many indicators to prove that these civil society initiatives, they emerge from society. These are people that care about topics in their communities. So this is why we support these initiatives. And then, so far we managed to handle these conversations, but it's true. It's getting harder, but therefore we also have become a bit louder about this message to other donors, to also inspire them and motivate them to move away from the restricted project funding and move into long-term unrestricted. Because if you really want to make an impact, look at the world around you. It's changing every day. These organizations need flexible funding, and they need to try new things. So let's give them the room to do that. And as well, the trust part is, of course, also very interesting, and I really like to talk about it also internally with our colleagues. What is trust? I mean, it's a word, but what does it look like in your partnership with organizations like MSF? And of course, it's tested, this trust-based relationship, when there is something happening. NGOs, operating in circumstances like your organization, Chris, it's so impressive, and you will talk about it, how you can operate in these contexts. And therefore, we need to be there with this funding, and especially when things go wrong, we are the first organization to stand up and say, listen, everywhere things go wrong, and imagine the circumstances where you have to deliver your operations. So we only will stand by our NGOs, and of course we expect them to inform us, that we rather not read things in the newspaper, but rather be informed by the organization themselves, that type of things. But then again, to work in such a partnership is also highly inspirational, and we strongly recommend it to other donors.
It's quite a brave thing to do, though, in the current climate, because we're in a state of flux. Issues and organisations that just a few years ago would have been uncontroversial or relatively uncontroversial in the political environment we're in right now might suddenly be seen to be controversial. I guess it would be easy for an organisation like yours to reduce your risk appetite to try to not get on the wrong side of governments, but it sounds to me as if you're kind of going in the opposite direction, which is a courageous thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the whole idea of support in society, that's something we should talk more about, and to make it explicit. The number of people that show their solidarity by giving to charity organizations, big or small, or taking part in community initiatives. These are high numbers. This is all over societies. So in that sense, there's also like a hidden story there. And also stories of progress. Organizations achieve progress every day. There are success stories, little stories, big stories in innovations, in health, in etc. So let's share these stories also to make sure that people keep on believing that these things are happening
Which
every
I think
day.
is so important just now, because I think people do feel a sense of powerlessness in the face of all of these big global events. So, and I think it is an opportunity to highlight, the sort of resilience that comes to the fore and the innovation that comes to the fore when things otherwise seem difficult. Chris, in terms of your work, again, an organisation that's been established for decades, humanitarian and international aid under a lot of pressure, facing a lot of cuts. How is that changing things practically for you? How are you having to adapt?
Yeah. It's so on one hand you can say, I made the point that we're privately funded. We have, there's been a huge cuts from the US government, but not only the UK, the Netherlands, Germany. And so the ecosystem as a whole, while we have financially not been touched so much, the ecosystem as a whole has been decimated. I was in Khartoum in January when the announcements about what was happening to USAID was happening. And as I was there just in the few days and speaking to local authorities in Khartoum who were trying to set up services after the front lines had moved, in that day that I spoke to the local commissioner, he'd said, I've had 5 organizations telling me that I have to stop programs just in those 24 hours because the margins on which people were running on was so thin. Since then, we've also, we just getting figures in from June in places like Baidoa in Somalia, where there's been around 40 health and nutrition programs closed. That means that we saw 12,000 children with malnutrition in the Baidoa region of Somalia in the month of June, which is a 76% increase from this point this time last year, the same period last year. See similar things in the Gambela region of Ethiopia. So we're seeing the patient load go up. And at the same time, a lot of the infrastructure that was there, the humanitarian architecture, as we call it, things like UN flights that a lot of NGOs would use, have gone or are not funded. So it's not only are we seeing more patients, but the cost per patient is going up as a consequence. So the gap is real and palpable, and so it is hugely impacting communities and people all around the world.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously the financial impact is, as you've described it, in terms of the ecosystem, but is there a sort of cultural shift in the environment you're working in? I think it seems to me that we've gone from a position in a relatively short period of time to there being a, not unanimous, but a broad sense that international humanitarian aid was the right thing to do from a moral perspective, but also from a self-interested perspective, to now being seen as something that is, against our self-interest, and we should be looking after people at home and not. Is that changing the sort of the more cultural environment in which you operate? Is there any shift there?
Well, I think the sort of popular solidarity element, I think, is still there. I think that people are still giving and wanting to support. People asking what we can do, and I think that is still there. If you look at the other end of the equation, though, if you look at somewhere like Gaza or Sudan, we're also thrust into despite trying to remain independent, we're thrust into the politics of what is happening in that conflict. We've seen aid being used, or the illusion of aid in many cases, being used as a way to justify the continuation of the conflict in Gaza. We see that in terms of airdrops of food, which have been ineffective, not only ineffective, but dangerous, a failed peer, and now most recently the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is forcibly, I would argue, displacing people, baiting people who are then getting injured and shot. We've seen thousands of people injured and dozens of people killed in our clinics. And so that operating environment is becoming even more explicitly politicized, and we're very aware that we're a pawn in that game.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you've mentioned Gaza. There will be enormous interest, I'm sure, in this room to hear more about the situation on the ground as you see it in Gaza. And I guess a question that springs to my mind, you're an organisation that values and is very rigorous about your independence, but how possible is it in a situation like Gaza to be independent?
I think, so we're aware that we are instrumentalized in this conflict, and I think the line that we are trying not to cross is becoming complicit. Now, where that is a judgment call, and one of the indicators there is, we know, I mean, everybody I'm sure is aware of the destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza. There's no Gazan hospital, Palestinian hospital, which is fully functional that's left. We tried for as long as possible to continue to work in the Ministry of Health hospitals to be able to support the infrastructure as part of the society that was being destroyed around us. The healthcare system, the water system, the electricity system. This is before we even talk about supply coming into Gaza. But we were forced to leave those hospitals, ostensibly on security grounds, to work in field hospitals, ostensibly with the argument of there can be no tunnels under the field hospitals, and therefore we trust these structures to be not Hamas strongholds in that sense. But in doing that, our reluctance to do that is, to what extent are we contributing to the destruction of the healthcare system? So it is a compromise in that sense, but we're still treating hundreds and thousands of patients on a daily basis. So are we free to make a choice about where we work and exactly what we do? No, in that sense, but also no in the sense that we don't get the supplies in at a rate and a predictability anywhere near what we should. I mean, there was complete siege between March and May this year, the mid-May. We've had a few trucks of supplies come in since then, but it's drip feeding to the extent that we're having to increase the treatment protocols for simply things like changing dressings. So the time between changing your dressing goes up between from one day to the next, to 2 days to 3 days, which of course increases the rate of infection, and then there's massive secondary consequences as a result of that. That's all before you get to the point, and which is probably the most important point, is that the vast majority of our staff in Gaza are Palestinian. And so they are themselves fleeing multiple times. Many of them have displaced 9, 10 times. They're living in tents on the beach in Al-Mawazi. They themselves are starving. 9 of them have been killed. And so they are, and they want to continue working. I said to start with, we have a responsibility in terms of safety and security, but they can't leave. And so even if we wanted to leave Gaza, we can't in that, because they're us. And so that puts us in a terrible sort of bind in terms of, are we free to make all the decisions that we want to make? Absolutely not. Are we committed to stay there as long as we can? Yes. How long will that be? We don't know. It's sort of one day, managing the risk from one day to the next. So it is really tested, not just from a practical point of view, but a political point of view and an ethical point of view on a daily basis.
I want to stick, before I bring Sigrid back in, just to stick with Gaza for another couple of minutes, because it is such a, and I think, speaking personally, and I'm sure I'll be speaking for many people in here, just this sense of despair, rage, impotence, disbelief that appears to be the case, that yet again we are witnessing a genocide and the world is standing by and watching. The United Nations appears impotent. I don't want to, lead you too far or any further than you're comfortable with into, taking a position here. But is genocide, is that a description you would recognise from your work on the ground? And is it difficult for an organisation like yours to be explicit about that? What's your perception of the United Nations role? What more could it be doing right now?
Yes, is the answer, and I think particularly the word I'd pick up where was description, because I think that's an important point to explain to where we got to in terms of a lot of the things that we've said around Gaza. I mean, I mentioned the two pillars, the medical action and the speaking out. That's easy to say, but in practice it's a continual tension, because we can speak out because we've got medical programs on the ground. If we speak out loudly against, in this case, obviously the Israeli government, who our presence is beholden to, we have to ask their permission, we negotiate their access with them. They can pull that at any time that they want, and so there is this continual balance, and that word in a way sounds complicit when you use the word balance in this situation. But there's a continual judgment, let's say, between how far we go in terms of what we say, and we have debated this point for almost 2 years now in terms of how far do we go. And there's been some key milestones on this. There was the ICJ ruling in terms of the provisional measures, some of which were directly pointing at humanitarian assistance in terms of the obligation of Israel to allow supplies in, also in terms of the protection of civilians, which liberated us to talk along those channels quite nicely. We had a bit of a big debate. We have some amazing lawyers working for us, but we're not a legal organization. We're not the ICJ. Is it our role to use the word genocide? Where do we look at that compared to ethnic cleansing? And gradually we moved on to the point of saying, well, the experts are saying it. We're seeing what the experts are saying qualifies as genocide, so let's talk about what we're saying and make that link. But I think the big liberating moment, at least for me, was moving away from this notion of are we qualified to qualify it versus is it the best description of the situation that is happening there. And so we are now in a situation where we're so uncertain about our future presence on the ground in Gaza that we have liberated ourselves. It's taken a while to use genocide as the description of what is happening in Gaza, but it's been a difficult journey to get there.
Okay, thank you. Before we go to questions, I want to maybe ask you to say a word about the situation in Sudan. But before that, Sigrid, I wonder from the perspective of your organisation. You're a lottery. You're encouraging people to play, to win prizes, and I guess there is a sense of pitching your organisation to encourage people to take part in that. But to what extent do you focus on that versus encouraging people to see playing your lottery as a direct, at the very least indirect way of helping people in Gaza, for example? How in this very politicised global environment that we're living in, how do you make these judgments about how you pitch what it is you're offering people?
Yes, it is. It's a balancing act, and at the same time we are in a luxury position that we have many ways of communicating to big audiences. So it's also the right message at the right time in the right channel, of course. But I think the people who join the lottery, of course, are dreaming, hopefully, of winning a nice prize. And at the same time, to include the message that when you play at any time, the charity partners are the winners every time again. And also to show the stories of initiatives close by, far away, where people are trying to make the world a better place and having a positive impact. And there, I think we really see it as like a second part of our mission, next to the fundraising part, to spread stories about the work of organizations like MSF or smaller initiatives in local communities, to inspire people and show, well, civil society are delivering vital services in our societies of today. So let's share these stories and also support each other in bringing these things further and and especially also the younger generation, and it's really great there are many in the audience, to show them that active citizenship is really something that is not only inspiring for yourself, but is helping so many people, and well, together we can have progress and make this world a better place. So that communication power that we have as an organization, we strategically look for the moments to bring like little documentaries or stories to the people, to the players, and well, big audience.
Yeah, no, I think that is so important, because I think right now it's, you know, it can be easy to focus on, you know, the dreadful things that are happening across the world, but I certainly detect this, you know, groundswell of desire to make a difference, and often at, you know, times of political upheaval, that's when civil society can really come to the fore. So the sort of role of your organisation to inspire people about what they can do through quite simple acts of playing your lottery. Look, I'm going to open up to questions in just a moment, but obviously we've been talking rightly about Gaza, and my own view is there's not nearly enough attention on Gaza and what we need to do to help people in Gaza, but of course other desperate situations don't even get the attention that Gaza does, and Sudan is another area you're working in. Do you want to just say something about the situation there before we open up?
Yeah, thanks. And one of the hardest things about talking about Gaza is not talking about other places. I mean, Sudan is a country of 50 million people. 1/5 of the population, around just over 12 million people, are displaced either in Sudan or in the borders around. Half of the population, we talked about famine in Gaza, but half the population are facing acute food insecurity. There was a famine declared in a camp called Zamzam, which is in Darfur, which was under siege for many, many months, and has since been attacked and decimated. And so the situation, the humanitarian crisis in Sudan is, don't use these superlatives often, is probably the biggest humanitarian crisis we've seen for decades, and it's not getting onto the TV screens. It is a very, very brutal war as well. Both sides, all sides in this conflict have carried out atrocities on civilians. The rates of sexual violence are horrendous. It's a war on people that we're seeing on a daily basis in Sudan. And going back a little bit to the first point, just before I was in Khartoum in January, I was in the Darfur region in December, and Darfur was the first place I worked for MSF 20 years ago during the previous Darfur crisis. And I came in through the Chad border crossing, because unlike back in 2005, it's impossible to fly people and supplies down to Darfur, because the country is de facto split in two. And I drove from the Chadian border further and further into Darfur day by day. It took me about three or four days. And the thing that struck me was I could never have done that in 2005 because of the security situation there prohibited traveling by road. We had to fly from place to place to place. And actually, in a way, it was much easier because you could just jump in the car and go. Now, why that is the case is also interesting and horrific, because a large number of the non-Arab tribes have been cleansed out of the area, so there's a control there. But if you looked at the needs and the humanitarian response that was there, the difference between the needs and what needed to be done was the biggest I've ever seen. So despite the fact that relatively easily you could get there, it's days, you need a whole logistics capacity behind you, but it was actually relatively straightforward. There was virtually no humanitarian response there. And yet in hospitals as far into Nyala, which is in South Darfur, there were fully, we were demonstrating it was clearly possible to run fully operational hospitals. And this is really on us. This is really on all of us. It's on the humanitarian community as much as anybody else to accept that we're failing in Darfur. And this was before the USAID funding cuts came in. And so, yes, there was a funding crisis, but it was not as bad, anywhere near as bad as this. And so there's an important point here that even if you double the money for somewhere like Sudan, there's a lot more to fix in terms of the politics and the intention before you can double the response as in line with that funding. And so I think it's not only is it a context in which the humanitarian situation is critical, it is also a critical challenge to the humanitarian community and the international community as a whole, basically to get our act together, because the lack of response was completely unacceptable.
Thank you for that. Right, I'm going to open up now. We've got some brilliant young people over here, and I'm going to try and take a question from there first. Not to say there's not brilliant young people in the rest of the audience as well.
Brilliant old
yeah,
people.
We have you here, and then we'll come to a couple of rows behind, and then we've got a couple of questions down in the front.
With so many voices and opinions on where funding and aid should go, how do you not get influenced by that, and then how do you make your decision on where action and where funding should be taken?
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to come to you first, Sigrid. Is how do you decide where to fund, who to fund, and where to put your money?
Yes, thank you for indeed a good question. So for us, it's important to realize that the funds we are talking about are the funds of our players, people in society, either here in Great Britain, Germany, Sweden, Norway, or the Netherlands in this case. And so for us, the key topic that we look for is the support in society that NGOs have, that civil society initiatives have. So, because that is an indicator that people in society support what they are doing, and that's for us a good reason then to also give them support. At the same time, we don't want them to become depending on lottery funding, because that would give not a healthy balance, and also would be risky in case our lottery would not stay successful. So we also think it's important not to give more like 20 or 25% of their total budget, which is already a lot, of course. So that is a rare situation. And then next to that, because now we are talking about big organizations, we have lottery foundations for specifically neighborhood initiatives. And so these are separate trusts where people can apply, and where we have very, not so bureaucratic procedures to easily give money to local initiatives in constituencies also all over Great Britain. So there are multiple ways in which we try to achieve really a big reach for our funding. And of course there's always a lack, there is always more demand and applications than we can handle. But the good thing is that we also achieve in increasing the funds that we raise every year. So in that sense we always welcome also new long-term partners every year.
And you fund like hundreds, thousands of organisations,
exactly.
Thank you. And just a couple of rows behind. Yeah.
How much more difficult is it for an organisation like Médecins Sans Frontières to operate in conflicts where, like you said, they don't receive as much media attention as conflicts like Gaza do? How much of a difference is there between operating in an area that's getting lots of global attention from the media and an area that's effectively forgotten?
Another great question, Chris.
That's a great question. I'm not sure it's necessarily the media attention which is the factor here. If you, I think I explained the sort of the complexities around Gaza, which is getting some media attention. If you look at somewhere like Ethiopia, for example, where there's much less media attention, it depends very much where in Ethiopia it is, and so. In some areas, it's much easier to get to, and we can have a big response. However, there's different loyalties, different factions within Ethiopia, and some of those are much harder to work in. So we can use the media attention to leverage our presence as well, to increase and to put pressure on. But that can also be detrimental in the sense that it can also work against us if we're seen as blaming somebody that has control over our presence. So I think it can work in both directions.
Great, thank you. Right, we've got a couple of questions in the front row here, here, and then we'll come back up. Anybody over this side? This is a quiet side of the room, and then we'll come over here. Yeah.
As Nicola will know, there is debate in Scotland at the moment about a national philanthropy strategy for Scotland, with consideration being given to that in Ireland, with which I imagine you're both familiar, which begs the question, should a nation have a national philanthropy strategy? What are the advantages and disadvantages from your side running what are already successful operations? And I'm in the middle of running a series of conversation meetings linked to the study being done at St Andrews University. and that involves donor-associated funds, all of those things, promotion of use of the best tax levers for philanthropy. I'd be very interested to hear your observations.
Great. Maybe one for you, Sigrid. Is a national philanthropy strategy in any country advantageous to you?
Yeah, I really liked the question because
Optimise.
to optimize. Yeah, well, I think, as you have explained, Chris, the character of civil society initiatives is that they are independent from governance and they play a different role than governance do. So, in that sense, it's a bit a sensitive thing. At the same time, I think it's a very positive thing when governments realize the potential of civil society initiatives for their communities. And so, in that sense, what is the role of governments in such a conversation to indeed create a context where fundraising initiatives can be successful, and even more than today, because there are hurdles everywhere, also in regulations around fundraising. And so to have this specific approach to make sure that you unleash the full potential of civil society initiatives, I would support, but indeed there is it's a balancing act, and civil society in itself has a responsibility to also be super clear towards governments what they need exactly. And that's always a difficult part also, to have this one voice of the civil society, of course. That's not an easy thing either.
But it may not
Great.
be led by government.
Yeah.
No, indeed, that's yeah.
Can we go here? Thank you.
Quick one. I'm speaking as a journalist. First, a big shout out to the young folk behind me who asked 2 great questions.
Indeed.
Budding journalists, clearly. And also going to do a very annoying thing of asking 2 in 1. Chris, journalism was part of the DNA of Médecins Sans Frontières. I think a lot of us in the room understand what you do medically.
Yeah.
Tell us how journalism plays into what you do now. Second, you talked about USAID, as we know, having moved out of Africa by all accounts. Is Any signs that China is stepping in?
Okay, I think just to give the people with microphones a heads up, we'll go here next, and then I think up somewhere over here. I see somebody up here. My eyesight is not the best. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah. So I think there's a very, very dynamic and changing role in terms of humanitarian aid and the relationship with journalism generally, as well as within MSF. And if you look at both Gaza and Sudan as case studies, it's almost impossible to get international journalists in. This is a big role in terms of accountability, and that's increasing the burden on humanitarian organizations to talk and present about what's going on. It's almost obligatory when you go there to talk about it and to get the message out. Of course, that can be challenged in the way that the notion of Palestinian journalists can be challenged. You're seeing it through a particular lens. And I think that burden that, as we've seen, unacceptable burden and toll on Palestinian journalists is also there on humanitarian workers as well. I think that we're committed as an organization to continue to do both things, the operations and speaking out. And that can take a number of different modalities. It can be press conference, press release, it can be the tweets, the public communication. It can also be bilateral engagement. Getting into these places requires negotiating with the belligerents on both sides. We're always trying to negotiate with both, and talking to them and pushing them behind the scenes as well. So it is fully integrated. It's part of the culture, but the pressure in terms of being a voice for areas where there are no journalists is growing palpably at the moment. China. Yes, a bit. I think there's a changing narrative from China, which is, from my perspective, positive. Our engagement with China has increased over the last 6 or 12 months. I don't think we're talking about funding to the same levels or the same way that the US government did from a humanitarian perspective. The Belt and Road Project is a sort of an economy-based program, but I think that I'm hesitating because I don't know in substantial detail, but I think what we are seeing is a change in approach to humanitarian work from China. it is not a replacement, a like-for-like replacement. I think it's also seen conceptually very differently, which is the reality that we have to face. But I would argue that I have experienced an opening of the relationship with China over the last 12 months or so.
Does it come with more strings attached, fewer strings attached,
well,
or different strings attached?
So it's not humanitarian funding in the same way. But I think that the engagement and the dialogue has increased. I don't think we've seen sort of tangible changes, but I would also caveat that with I'm not an expert on that.
Okay, we have a question here, and then up at the back, and then if we've got time, I'll go to the back of the middle row.
I'm the former head of the Open University course, Winning Resources and Support, which some of you may have done, but you obviously got very good fundraising strategies. But what I wanted to ask is about the ethical issues in fundraising, because I think these are quite problematic in terms of the images that are used to depict the cultures that you're working with. I mean, black African babies shown on their own, that never happens. There's always family to step in, for example. And I just wonder what debates you have about those within your organisation, but also about how you support your workers to deal with the traumas that they must encounter day in and day out. Because burnout is the biggest problem, in my experience, in development organisations.
So I guess you've probably both got things you want to say there. Sigrid, the whole kind of ethical element of fundraising, how do you deal with that?
Yes, I think lots of things have been developing in the past years. It's, I think as an example, in our office, in our headquarters in Amsterdam, we had beautiful images of lots of places all over the world, also coming from charities from a long time. I think we changed mostly all the pictures on the walls, just as an example, as an illustration with all our blind spots. And I think same for our charity partners. We see lots of work being done in that area, and that we have to learn every day what we are doing, what we are communicating, and of course it's with good intentions, but it can be perceived in a very different way. So I'm quite positive about these developments, and they need attention, but they get attention, yes.
Okay, and you might want to say something about that, Chris, but the point about how you support your staff working in these very high-pressured areas.
I think both of the points, in a way, are similar in terms of this is the areas as organisations we're really having to challenge ourselves to go to do, duty of care. Now, I think is one of the next frontiers of humanitarian action. It's like, what is our responsibility, not just from a security point of view, but from a well-being point of view. We've travelled a distance on that. We're not where we should be. We've travelled a big distance in terms of images as well. If you look at the images that we use now compared to even 5-10 years ago, it's very different, and we've learned a lot then. It's been painful as well to sort of look back at some of our history and some of the images that we have used and say, was that really us? And yes, it was us. We actually did a small anecdote. We did a big, thorough cleanup of we've got a massive photo database with sort of millions and millions of photos in it. And we did a very intensive review of all of those photos. And then there was a question of what do we do with the ones that we're not happy with? We don't want to use them anymore. But we have to keep them. We have to keep them because it's evidence of where we've come from and what we do, and we need to discuss that, and we need to be open about that and look and be able to learn from it. So we still have those photos clearly marked with do not use anymore. But both of those two factors are at the forefront of challenging ourselves what it is to be an organisation. And like any organisation, there's people in there who make mistakes, we make wrong decisions, we make policy choices that we're not happy with. We learn as we go along. But both those two things are really challenging who we are as an organisation.
Thank you. Right, I suspect we've only got time for a couple more questions. So the gentleman towards the back, I can't see faces, I can just see a sea of hands. So if you can fight amongst yourselves a bit.
Good sign,
which of you is going to ask a question? Then I'm going to come back to take a last one from one of the young people. So can we maybe take these questions? We'll take them all together, and then I'll pass them to Sigrid and Chris.
Okay, thanks a lot. Chris, I just wanted to come back on this point about Sudan and the refugees coming outside. Also in the humanitarian sector, and colleagues there are saying that the funding cuts, I think this talk was supposed to be about the UK, US and European funding cuts, are now driving people from there to make the hazardous journey across the desert to Libya, then into Europe and possibly on the boats. That is such a huge political issue here. So I'd like to know what kind of lobby and this goes to Sigrid as well, and the donors and the Scottish Government and all else, surely dropping funding to these critical humanitarian crises is only going to lead to a large new scale of migration, as people will migrate before they actually die.
Yeah. I'm going to actually take that one on its own, because I think that is such an important point, that utterly, aside from the immorality of what we're seeing in terms of funding cuts, the utterly self-defeating nature of it, and how do we get this sort of joined up understanding of the impacts of what we're seeing right now.
I mean, it's one of those sort of potential narrative clashes that need to be put on the table, because that's not the basis on which we allocate funding or allocate resources internally. It is not because of Sudanese refugees in Chad migrating to Europe. We allocate funding because the medical humanitarian needs for those people in Chad is acute, and we need to treat them as best as we can. There is obviously within domestic politics in the UK and all around the world, this sort of it helps us as well. That's not the reason we do it. We do it because the people need it there. I would also say that people along the migration routes, and if you look at the extent to which people have been pushed back in the Mediterranean, we have had a project of a boat in the Mediterranean which rescues people at sea, which is obviously highly controversial, because we're then accused of a pull factor, complicity with gangs and that sort of thing, which we would very strongly and robustly counter. But they're people who are in crisis and in medical need, and that basically that's the window through which we try and look at the world. Whether you're in Sudan, you're in Chad, or you're on a migration route, it's not then what happens to you after that point, and the consequences. It's because you need this attention now.
Yeah. I think this is, in fairness, more of a challenge to politicians than to Sigrid.
I was going to say maybe it's
yeah. I mean, but it is. If we think about politics here in the UK, increasingly gripped and I would argue distorted by debates around immigration and the small boats, and yet an inability to make the connection to push back against climate action, cuts in international aid. All of these things will drive migration and population displacement. So there's a disjointed public debate around these things that I think it is for politicians to try to do something about. So I think it's a really good and important question. Right, have you decided? Right, we've got the back, and I'm going to take these two questions together. So whoever won the battle in the sea of hands at the back, and then we're coming down to the young people again.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask a question about the ethics piece again, and this is about operational delivery and funding. And that's to do that in war zones in particular, there's really not a distinct line between military and civilian. They tend to blend in together. Military supports the civilian infrastructure, particularly in medicine, and medicine equally the military. And I'm just trying to understand how you manage to, from both your different perspectives, deal with that kind of conflict where people don't want stuff to be, their donations and their money to be used in a military context and a military to go to the military, yet, and particularly in a conscripted army like we have in Ukraine, that's actually, there's another ethical dimension to that. How do you balance all that off? Because it's something we really struggle with here.
Yeah, great. And can we take, I don't know who's got the microphone, take a last question, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, as we see more efforts by governments and non-governments alike in countries around the world and arguably the UK to dehumanize people even further, how that sort of effort affects your work in sort of humanitarian and your access to those groups of people specifically?
Okay, two good questions. I'm going to go to Sigrid and then to Chris, or the other way around if you prefer, and give you the opportunity to say any final things that you want to say that you haven't. I've had a big finish sign waved at me at the back, so I need to draw things to
I leave it to Chris, because this is the expertise of Chris, and that's what we want to say to other donors. Stick to where you have your expertise, and when it comes to these type of topics, this is your work.
I think in a war zone, if you're wounded and you're a combatant, you're treated like anybody. You were treated like anybody else, and we would accept anybody in our clinics. there is a difference between that and sort of support, which is strategically supporting one side or the other, and particularly if you're looking at it from a sort of a donation point of view. So we always ensure that we're hands-on, right? We very, very rarely give a medical donation. It does happen, but usually with a strategy to follow up, a medical donation in isolation. Our policy is to be hands-on, deliver it ourselves so that we're touching, seeing, treating our patients. That doesn't mean that people aren't interested in where our operations are. And one of the reasons if you look at our presence in Darfur, I was talking previously, we released a pretty damning report on what we were hearing from people coming out of the Zamzam camp after it was attacked a few months ago. Horrific stories in terms of men, women, and children. And the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, the opposition forces, are clearly very, very frustrated with this report. They're blaming us for stirring the tribal tensions, to which I said that this happened, and then we reported on it, so it can't be that way around. But at the same time, we're still there because they need our medical services in their territory. So there is, we shouldn't be naive. There is always this element of people are interested in our presence there. You can say the same thing for Gaza. If there wasn't an interest for having us there, we wouldn't be there. So it's something I'm aware of, but I don't think there's so much of a question of strategically supporting a military or another. The question was over there was about your faces saying you can't remember other.
Yeah, and
yes,
how does that?
Yes, no, it's hate speech is common, or I think probably on the rise in various parts of the world. It impacts our access directly. Ethiopia is an interesting example where there has been hate speech between different groups, but also towards humanitarian organizations. And so it's dehumanizing different groups, which raises tensions, but also humanitarian actors as well. And so that clearly creates issues of access, because if we're not trusted, if people don't believe, we don't go in with military support, we don't have armed guards, we're just there based on what we can deliver from a medical perspective. But if people don't trust us, then that impacts our access and the ability to do our work. Can I say one last?
Of course you can, yeah.
So just one. There's a slightly different point that I want to end on, and that is, I hope this is not too much of a juxtaposition, but everywhere that I go and places that I go and meet, not only do I feel proud and enjoy the work not only do I feel proud and admire the work the team's doing, I enjoy it, and I have great moments, interactions with people, with our staff, all around the world. Driving through Gaza last March, I was in the front seat of the car, and I was being given basically a tourism of Gaza, and saying this is where these are the vineyards where we used to grow the grapes for our wine. I bet you didn't know that Gazans produce wine. We're a bit naughty, And it's this sort of stuff and these sort of interactions that happen all the way around the world that you see on a daily basis. The sort of the community interactions, the interactions between fathers, children, people supporting together and collaborating, because we can't go there if people don't work and support. And so, rightly, we've had a conversation about a lot of the challenges and negatives. We've had a good conversation in terms of a positive partnership, but also, it's not all dark out there.
Yeah, I think
that's the key point that I want to. There's a lot of humanity, a lot of solidarity that is there, and that's often lost. And I think it's an important point to end on.
I think that's a great point to end on, because often you hear that question right now: what is the hope for the future? And I think you're right. It's in the basic fundamental humanity of people across the world. I think it's in the next generation, and it's in the work of organisations like the two represented here that people like us can support to try to advance some of that hope and optimism for the future. Look, this has been a fascinating discussion. I think we could have gone on a lot longer, but I'm in danger of definitely outstaying my welcome on the stage here. So Sigrid and Chris have been fantastic guests. It's, I hope, given you an insight into the work that they do, and I'm sure they would appreciate your support now and in the future. But please, for now, give them a massive thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to swiftly move on to the lunchtime sessions. So as Mark mentioned earlier, we have the Scottish Humanitarians session here now starting in the main marquee. But if you fancy going outside, we also have the Dabka dance workshop in the Wall Garden, the Jacobite talk in the chapel, and Nigel Osborne is now going out for a walk, and if you could meet him outside in the bookshop. After that, we then have a chalk session made of sugar, which will be starting at 12:55. Thank you.